we are to chapter 25. There's only 8 chapters left. So when we finish these 2, there'll be 6. So I think we can finish the book this week if Miss Bouse keeps reading 2 a day. Okay? So chapter 25, A Bold Accusation. The Crown and Cushion was only a few streets away. Even I knew where it was, though I'd never been inside, as it was full of men drinking pints of ale and using bad language. How could Rose have gotten lost between here and there? I pushed against the heavy door at the top of the stairs and nearly tumbled into the corridor. My hands were filthy, and I had a suspicion that I wore cobwebs in my hair. Poor Miss Mary Ann, having to sleep there. I wiped my hands to my coat and considered where I might begin to look for Rose. But who should be standing by the desk, leaning on it with one casual hand, but the man who had been in my thoughts moments earlier. He thwacked a hat against his leg, spraying droplets of rain all over the tiled floor. Well, my lucky day, said Mr. Fibley in the odd, croaky voice. My spell in the cellar had left me chilled and clammy. This was no one's lucky day. Rose's mother was dead. Miss Mary Ann was in a dungeon, possibly in the company of rats. And suspect number 1 stood before me, face bright with cheer. Here I am. The reporter propped his hat on the desk and flicked open his notebook. Chatting with the amiable Constable Rushton, waiting to speak with the mermaid room murderess, and who should appear but Miss Agatha Morton, the indomitable mystery queen. How is it that you beat me to the scene every time? Not bad for a 12-year-old. Are you trying to take my job? My voice had disappeared down my throat. How dare he be nonchalant and jolly? He had likely mixed mouse poison into a sugar bowl. At the very least, he had written rubbish in the newspaper for all the world to read. Rose's words came to mind. I am too angry to listen to you just now, I said. Please do not speak to me. I heard Mummy tisking. That sounded too rude, even if he were a poisoner. Well, until perhaps next week, I added. Mr. Fibley tossed back his head and laughed, showing off immaculate white teeth. Waiting a week in the news business is not a viable option, he said. You are clever enough to understand that. I need today's truth today. Today's truth? My heart thumped. Today's truth is that Miss Mary Ann Eversham is not guilty of murdering her sister-in-law. You've already got that wrong, and I think you know it. Mr. Fibley raised an eyebrow, high above the gold rim of his spectacles. He had rather nice eyes, I noticed in surprise, though I only looked into them for half a moment before directing my gaze downward. Could a murderer have nice eyes? And was there any resemblance between Mr. Fibley and the woebegone prisoner in the cell below? I am most curious to hear your opinion on the matter, Miss Morton. If your dance teacher is not guilty, then who has performed this heinous act? Who indeed? Was he attempting to misdirect my suspicions? Might I lead him into an accidental admission of his guilt? I would not begin with the subject of murder, but tackle instead his irresponsible journalism. You replied in your report that I accused Mr. Fusswell, I said. I admit that he is fairly loathsome, but he is not a killer. What you wrote has injured his reputation and presented me a silly girl. Fairly loathsome, repeated Mr. Fibley. May I quote you on that? No, I said. You make a show of caring what people say, but what gets published is entirely unrelated to the truth, despite your claims. Did I write something down you did not say? Blood pounded noisily in my ears that I had difficulty remembering exactly. You twisted my intentions. Oh, did I? Said Mr. Fibley. I did not say that Roddy Fusswell murdered her or suggest that he brought the poison with him. Did you not? Stop it! I stamped my foot, just as Mummy had earlier. I stomped it again because it felt good. What really matters is that Rose's mother is dead and that Miss Mary Ann did not kill her. Have you considered the notion that Rose herself is the most suspicious of anyone? Of course I had. Not so long ago I had contemplated the possibility, with some sympathy, that Rose had sent her mother to the grave. But Miss Mary Ann's sad tale had confirmed her niece's innocence. It wasn't Rose, I said. The killer was a man. Oh, she shouldn't tell him that. Aggie, keep your mouth shut. Mr. Fibley jerked to attention, his fingers deftly opening the notebook and readying the pencil. What makes you think that? A man recently arrived in Torquay and not well known. It turned out not to be so difficult to look a killer in the eye, now that I was fired up, and with a constable sitting across the room, inattentive as he was. A man of about your age. Mr. Fibley examined me with a hard stare, and then began to laugh. Are you accusing me of murder? With blazing eyes, Mr. Fibley stepped toward me, a smile on his lips. Was he dangerous? Armed with a pistol? Hiding a dagger? I stepped back a pace and looked over at the desk sergeant, who was chomping on an apple and paying no attention to the deadly drama playing out before him. Should I scream? The main door opened with a loud bang. Wind whistled in along with the most welcome face. Hector! I ducked around the reporter and raced to greet my friend. Goodness, you're wet. Hector stood in the doorway, blinking as if surprised to enter a room holding light and people. His hair and jacket, his short trousers and stockings were all as wet as if he'd pulled them on straight from a washing tub. Oi, called the officer from behind the desk. Close the door like a good lad, won't you? Devil of a night out there. Hector pushed the door shut and began to shake. My cap is lost. His plaster down hair made it look as if his head had been dipped in ink. His shoes made a slurping sound as he stepped toward me. I knew from my own misadventure last night exactly how awful that felt. Poor Hector, I said. Such a lot has happened. You're lucky I'm still here. Mr. Fibley was lurking too close by. Where is your quarry? The caterpillar goes to the hotel, said Hector, pausing to kick some fishing nets along the way. He sits in the bar to drink the whiskey. I'm watching from the terrace, one glass of whiskey, then another, and then another. I believe he is intoxicated and not a threat this night, so I come to find you. Roddy Feswell's not the killer, I whispered. You've been following the wrong man. The wrong man? Hector's gloomy look darkened. His lips were the color of spring violets. You know this? He removed his jacket and jiggled it, causing a small rainstorm. She thinks I am the killer, said Mr. Fibley suddenly at my elbow. You, sir? Hector looked at me. I have acquired a heap of new information. I took Hector's hand and guided him behind one of the columns that held up a dark and distant ceiling. Mr. Fibley followed us. If you're accusing me of murder, he said, I have every right to know the reasons you... Please to tell me something, said Hector. I am most curious. I don't want to speak while he is listening, I said. He has a very bad habit of taking a person's words and twisting them into... Hector led me to the very center of the police station foyer. Speak quietly, he said. The man will become dizzy trying to tread on our trails. I bent my head next to Hector's and murmured as efficiently as I could. The baby in the letter belonged to Miss Mary Ann, but she never knew him before the first moment of his life. She couldn't keep him. The baby was sent away, adopted, and the captain provided money for support. Mrs. Eversham was furious about the baby. The letter was written to Rose, but Rose never saw it because her mother... Oh! I had forgotten for a few minutes about Rose. Rose was meant to be here, but... Mr. Fibley was again hovering close by, though I felt certain that he could not have heard my rapid report to Hector. If you do not permit me to consult with my associate, I told him, I shall have no choice but to report you at once to the officer. Why are you waiting? Said the reporter. I'll make it easy and do it for you. He pretended to address the man across the room, speaking in a squeaky whisper. Oh, Constable, this little girl thinks I'm the mermaid room killer, and she surely knows what she's talking about because she writes poems and has a vivid imagination. Hector stopped blowing on his fingers to give me a sympathetic smile. His manner is sarcastic, but from what you tell me so far, there is no evidence to make such a grave accusation. You haven't heard everything yet, I said. I have almost the necessary evidence. I glared at Mr. Fibley. And why don't you say you're innocent or anything else to dissuade me? I know two things you don't, said Mr. Fibley. I turned my back on him and spoke rapidly to Hector. I have just delivered a document to Miss Mary Ann in her jail cell that confirms that the killer was a young man not from Torquay who... What document? Mr. Fibley propped open his notebook on his shoulder. How did it come into your possession? What two things? Said Hector. Why do you not assist in clearing your own name? Am I obliged to defend myself to children? Said Mr. Fibley. Why do you always answer a question with a question? I wish to thump him on the head. Do I? Said Mr. Fibley, smiling. I remind you, said Hector, a woman has come to a most unpleasant end. A convincing point, said Mr. Fibley. Here is my first offense. I have never, to my knowledge, met Mrs. Eversham. Why would I want her dead? Another question, I muttered, but had the answer ready. The document identifies the killer as a man and also suggests very strongly that he is unknown to the victim. So, Mr. Cleverboots, you are not yet in the clear. You have a second item. I do, said Mr. Fibley. And it is? He looked at me and then to Hector and then back to me, as if not certain that this was the audience for his next words. He cleared his throat, and when his voice came, it was softer. I ask that this revelation remain in your pockets. He said, can I trust you? But of course, said Hector. I suppose, I said. Was this another trick? The grave calm of his look told me it was not. The foolery had no place in this admission. I am not the man you're looking for, said Mr. Fibley. Because I'm not a man at all. Eek. End of chapter 25. All right, chapter 26. A surreptitious unmasking. I gasped. Mr. Augustus Fibley was not a man? Remarkable. Hector gazed at Mr. Fibley with what looked like admiration. You make a most convincing gentleman. I peered more closely. Smooth face, nice eyes. I made a blurting noise and quickly manufactured a cough to cover my confusion. I'd been blind to so many clues. The raspy voice, the pretty lashes, the whiskerless cheeks and chin. But if she was a woman, why was she dressed like a man? How long has she dressed this way? What was her real name? Did anyone else know the truth? Did simply everyone have a secret? You do realize, said Mr. Fibley, Miss Fibley, your silence is essential. The masquerade protects my livelihood. As a woman, I would be relegated to reports on church suppers and tips for growing better dahlias. As a man, I can write the stories that people want to read, like murder. She grinned and raised her eyebrows, assuming my understanding of such an equation. I thought of Mr. Standfast saying that women could not be lawyers, and here was Mr. Fibley saying the same about crime reporters. I had not paid much attention to the things in the small world of Mummy and Granny and me, but for now there was a far more pressing matter at hand. If Mr. Fibley was a woman, she was not Miss Mary Ann's baby and not the killer. If Mr. Fibley was not the killer, then who was? Oi, girl! My head shot up, and Mr. Fibley's did the same next to me, something I would not have remarked 2 minutes ago. Constable rushed away from behind the desk. Miss Morton, isn't it? Yes, sir. A second voice interrupted. How did you get in here? Another policeman, older and even rounder than his colleague, had come into the lobby through one of the paneled doors that lined the back wall. His boot heels clicked as he strode across the tiles to confront Miss Fibley. How would I remember what name to call her without making trouble? It was best, I thought, if I did not try. She was dressed as a he and wanted to be known as a he. If I allowed myself to think of her, as a woman, I might reveal the truth in error. Until I knew a reason to expose him, he would continue as Mr. Fibley, as far as I cared. I've spoken to you once already today, young man. No journalist inside the police station. The reporter looked over at the fellow behind the desk who had been quite chummy earlier, but now pretended not to see him. We don't want your kind in here, said the new one. Off with you. He pointed at the door, his arm as rigid as a signpost. Mr. Fibley pushed up his glasses and tried to smile. Guilty as charged, he said. A journalist inside your station. Who knows what I might write about that? He stuffed his notebook into the pocket of his jacket and slunk toward the door, pausing to grin at me. I'm not going far, he said. Just a turn or two around the block for some fresh air. There's plenty more to this story, and I intend to dig out every dark little secret. The senior officer closed the door behind him. Miss Morton, said Constable Rushton. Hector touched my arm and tipped his head toward the policeman who was calling my name. I'm going off duty now, said Constable Rushton. Sergeant Cornell is taking over, but I've been tending this for your friend, Miss Eversham. He opened a cupboard behind the desk. She left it in my care, he said. Too heavy for a lass to be lugging about in the rain. He was holding Mr. Standfast's valet. Where did she go? He shrugged. Will you take it or not? The man was pulling on his overcoat. Yes, I said. Did she leave a message for me? It's just that we're meant to be... Do you know when she'll be back? No, he said. She asked could she leave it for a bit, and off she went, not to fret. A girl that age, head in the clouds, probably went to meet a boy, I'd wager. She did not, I said. I did not like his smirk. She went to find a lawyer, I said to Hector, as we sat with the case on the bench between us. They missed each other in the dark. We'll go look in a moment, but the temptation to pry buzzed loudly in my ears. Hector patted the lid. Is it locked? Dare we? I whispered. How can we not? Said Hector. They're going to break into the lawyer's briefcase, aren't they? Do you think they're looking for the will? Keep watch, I said. Mr. Standfast is talking with Miss Mary Ann in the dungeon. We should probably take it to him, but what harm could a few more minutes cause? You whistle if that door opens. I lifted one latch and then the other. Ever so gently, I raised the lid of the case half an inch. Not locked. Mummy will faint dead away if I'm arrested for rifling private documents. Do so rapidamente, said rapidamente. And it wasn't, the other word was Spanish. Rapidamente, I think, said Hector. I will divert the guard. He strolled across the marble floor. I am begging pardon, I heard him ask. I'm having the question for how to being a policeman. His accent has suddenly become thicker, part of his disguise. Most people imagine that a boy who could not speak English was likely short of brain friction. Ha! Brave and clever Hector. And here I was, afraid to open a box. I took a deep breath, imagining the satisfaction of finding another clue ahead of Augustus, the trickster Fibley. Up went the lid. Right on top were two thick envelopes, each labeled with a curving black script. Last will and testament of Captain Giles Eversham and last will and testament of Irma Millicent Eversham. As curious as I was to know the contents, it felt that opening a lady's will would be like cracking open her coffin. I shuffled those envelopes aside. The next document was a list, a record of pounds sterling lined up with particular dates, but without names or other details. Below that was a collection of letters held together at the top with a pen. I glanced up. Hector was still in deep conversation with the officer. How long would his silly questions keep? The door to the cellar was still shut. I ducked my head back down and began to read the first page. A letter dated 4 months earlier. Dear Mr. Standfast, thank you for your letter of Friday last. Also your note when my wife passed on to her heavenly rest in February. I'm sorry to hear of the captain's passing. He was good to my boy. The allowance was a big help here on the farm. Our son has grown up strong and handsome, but he's a man of his own mind now, wants to be away from home. I thank you on his behalf for the captain's bequest. Most sincerely. My heart just about stopped when I came to the signature. William F. Cable. Cable? What do you have? I jumped, pinching my fingers as I slammed down the lid. Oi! Only Hector, thank goodness. I snapped shut the latches and stood up to whisper as closely to his ear as I could get. I know who wrote the anonymous letter. I horribly, awfully, dreadfully believe that he is also the killer. I haven't told you Miss Marianne's whole story because of Mr. Fibley being nosy, and now, well, I looked, I spied, just a glimpse, really, but all of it has collided, and I do not follow, said Hector. We jumped from Mr. Roddy Fusswell to Mr. Augustus Fibley and now somewhere else? Roddy could never have been the killer because he has 2 parents of his own, you see, and he grew up in Torquay, so he couldn't be the baby, and the baby's the killer. The killer does not have a family? Said Hector. It is a baby cast out without attachment? He was adopted, I said. There's no time to explain everything, but it's not Roddy and it's not Mr. Fibley either, because he's not a mister. Hector tapped the valet. You find something that tells you? I'm worried about Rose. I said she left the case. The case into which your nose is poking? Said Hector. She went to find Mr. Standfast, but he came back without seeing her, so where is she? Rose is gone? What do you mean gone? I am running here from watching Roddy Fusswell, said Hector. Your horse Belle is trotting on the harbor road toward the Royal Victoria Hotel. I am for a moment elated. A ride, perhaps. But the fog churns like steam from a kettle. I jumped to one side and noticed as a small beetle. Rose Eversham is sitting behind Mr. Leonard. Asleep, maybe, with eyes shut. Hector slumped his shoulders and let his head drop crookedly to the side. I think to myself she is woeful from seeing her aunt in this dismal location. But that was ages ago, I cried. We must find her at once. What does the worry? Said Hector. She is in a cozy bed by now, is she not? Just as I would like to be. No, I cried. She's not at home in a cozy bed. She's with Leonard, and Leonard Cable is the killer. Ah, it was Leonard. Leonard Cable, no. That's the end of the chapter.